It feels like every day the news gets more complicated. Less like reading headlines and more like trying to solve one of those puzzles with 1,000 pieces.
Oh, yeah, totally. 1,000 pieces that someone keeps swapping out for different ones.
Exactly. So that's where we come in. Today, we're diving into some pretty intense developments related to the ongoing conflict. We've got reports coming in from everywhere, and honestly, it's a lot to sift through.
It really is.
So we're going to try to break it all down for you. We're talking potential new agreement in the Black Sea, EU troop deployment discussions, the whole U.S. aid situation, what the EU is doing to prepare, and then the never-ending question of peace negotiations.
Lots of moving pieces.
Big time.
Yeah.
So think of this as your cheat sheet to figuring out what actually matters right now. What do we need to pay attention to?
Well, and the interesting thing is how these different pieces all connect. You know, what happens with maritime security can affect the conversations about aid, which can then totally change the direction of any peace talks.
It's like a domino effect.
Yeah, it really is. Everything's kind of feeding into everything else.
All right, so let's jump right into this Black Sea situation. It sounds like there might actually be some progress towards a new agreement. Vice President Vance even hinted that a deal could be really close, like right around the corner. And he even said it might help de-escalate things more broadly.
Right, and the proposed Black Sea Initiative, it's kind of like that grain deal we saw before, the one that started in July of 2022 and went for a year.
Right.
The main goal is the same, like then and now. They want to make sure ships can travel safely through the Black Sea, you know, so they can keep transporting those essential goods.
Yeah, that's a big deal for, like, global supply chains. If everything gets disrupted there, it causes problems everywhere. But so we had a similar deal before. Why did it fall apart?
Well, Russia backed out. They felt like they were getting the short end of the stick. Ukraine could ship their grain no problem, but Russia said they were still hitting roadblocks when they tried to get their own agricultural products out to the global market, like even stuff like fertilizers.
So they felt like the deal wasn't fair.
Yeah, basically. Like it wasn't a two-way street.
So with this new initiative, what's changed? Are they doing anything differently this time to address what Russia was complaining about? I know there were those talks in Riyadh recently.
Exactly. There were high-level talks in Riyadh involving the U.S., Russia, and Ukraine. And a lot of it was about how to get safe shipping happening again in the Black Sea and to basically bring back peaceful trade. After those talks wrapped up, there were reports that the U.S. offered Russia some assurances to, like, sweeten the deal.
Okay, so what were those assurances? What did the U.S. put on the table?
Well, they reportedly said they'd help Russia get back into the global market for their agricultural exports, which, like we said, includes fertilizers. They talked about ways to lower the cost of maritime insurance, which is huge when you're shipping stuff internationally. Oh, and they also discussed giving Russia easier access to ports and payment systems, specifically for these kinds of transactions.
So it sounds like they're really trying to head off those issues Russia had before. But then I also read that Moscow has some conditions of its own before they'll agree to this new Black Sea initiative.
Yeah, for sure. Moscow has said, straight up, that this thing hinges on certain sanctions being lifted. A big one is getting Russelkozbank, which is a major Russian agricultural lender, hooked back up to the SWIFT international payment system. They also want the sanctions on companies that make and export food to be gone.
And here's where things get tricky, right? Because the EU has been really big on those sanctions. So what are they saying about lifting them?
That's the million-dollar question, and it's where things could get sticky because the EU has reportedly said no to lifting those sanctions. And since some of what Russia wants falls under the EU's control, it's kind of setting up this clash. Like, the U.S. seems willing to negotiate on those points to get the Black Sea deal done, but the EU's sticking to their guns on sanctions.
It really shows you how messy this whole international diplomacy thing is.
Oh, for sure. It's not just about two countries hashing things out one-on-one.
Definitely not. And it's not just trade either. Those sources also mentioned that the talks in Riyadh included the issue of attacks on energy infrastructure.
Yeah, that was another big topic. Russia came out and said they were putting a stop to attacks on energy infrastructure. Started March 18th, supposed to last 30 days.
And moratorium.
Right, exactly. But have those attacks actually stopped completely? Because I've seen conflicting reports.
It wouldn't be this situation if there weren't conflicting reports.
True that. So Russia says they're sticking to the moratorium, but then they turn around and accuse Kyiv of breaking it. And then, of course, Ukraine denies it. This whole back and forth just shows you how much mistrust there is. Makes you wonder if these pauses can even work if there's no real way to make sure everyone's doing what they said they would.
Okay, let's shift gears a bit and talk about these discussions about EU troop deployments. This is big, right? President Zelensky even announced a meeting in Kiev specifically about this. Who's going to be there?
Well, Zelensky said it's going to be a small group. He specifically mentioned France, Britain, and Ukraine. So that tells you they're not messing around. They're going straight to the countries they think are most likely to be on board with this.
Makes sense. So what's the main goal of this meeting? What are they hoping to get out of it?
It seems like the big thing is to show off what Ukraine already has in terms of infrastructure and to get everyone on the same page about what a potential EU troop deployment would even look like. Zelensky even used the phrase 100% ready when he talked about the countries he wants involved. So it seems like they want concrete commitments, not just vague promises.
So this isn't just a casual chat with the whole EU. It's more like a targeted strategy session. What happens after this meeting in Kiev? What's next?
The plan, from what we're hearing, is to have more talks at the National Security Advisor level, and then eventually a big summit all about security guarantees for Ukraine. This actually builds on some earlier conversations, like that Coalition of the Willing summit they had in Paris, which was Macron and Starmer's idea. That one was also about figuring out how to keep Kiev safe once the fighting is over.
So long-term planning.
Yep. Thinking ahead. And there are different ideas floating around about where these EU troops would actually be stationed if they do end up going to Ukraine.
Oh, yeah. Like what?
The Associated Press reported that they're looking at putting troops in central or western Ukraine, further away from the main fighting, or maybe even stationing them in a totally different country, maybe for logistics or training.
Makes sense.
And get this, Bloomberg News said that this EU military force could be as big as 30,000 troops.
Whoa, that's a lot of people. So how's Russia feeling about all this talk about EU troops? I can't imagine they're thrilled.
Shocker, right? They've condemned any kind of military aid to Ukraine, including sending in EU troops. They're basically saying it will just drag the fighting out without changing who wins in the end. Foreign Minister Lavrov really hammered on this, saying they need to address the root causes of the conflict and that European peacekeepers are a hard no. So, yeah, Russia's not happy about the idea of more foreign military in Ukraine.
Not at all.
Okay.
Let's talk money now. Specifically, this debate about whether the U.S. military aid to Ukraine should be treated as debt.
Yeah.
President Zelensky had some strong words about this recently.
Oh, yeah. He basically said, nope, not going to happen. He said Ukraine will not recognize U.S. military aid as debt. And he said this while they were talking about a new agreement for developing Ukraine's mineral resources.
So hold on, what's the connection here? Why is this mineral agreement tied up with U.S. aid?
Ukraine and the U.S. have been going back and forth about an agreement for working together on exploring and developing Ukraine's mineral resources. And Zelensky said that the latest U.S. draft proposal for this agreement is like a totally different thing from what they were looking at before.
Completely different.
Yeah, that's what he said.
And he wasn't happy about it?
Not really. He said, yeah, Ukraine's super grateful for all the help from the U.S., but it's not alone. And they won't let it be treated like one. And there are reports that the Ukrainian government's looking at this new agreement really closely, and people are saying it might actually be a step backwards from what they had before.
Not good.
Yeah.
And I read some reports about the specifics of this new draft agreement. It sounds kind of shady.
Yeah, European is reporting that this new draft resource deal might have this clause about paying back the U.S. for the aid they've given. And it's pretty specific. They're saying the U.S. would get all the royalties from developing these minerals until Ukraine pays back at least $100 billion, plus a 4% surcharge. So basically, they'd be using Ukraine's natural resources to pay off a debt.
That's rough.
Yeah.
And it's interesting because there are all these different numbers flying around about how much aid the U.S. has actually given Ukraine.
Ukraine has said the whole conflict has cost them around $320 billion, with Ukrainians paying $120 billion themselves, and the U.S. and EU covering the other $200 billion.
So lots of different numbers.
Yeah, so who knows what the real number is, but it definitely adds another layer of complication to this whole repayment thing.
For sure. And have these mineral deal talks been going on for a while?
Since like early February, apparently.
Yeah.
And the word was that they were going to sign the agreement when Zelensky went to Washington, but then that trip got canceled.
Interesting. Okay, let's zoom out a bit and look at what the EU's doing to prepare for.
Yeah.
Well, everything that's going on. They seem to be getting ready for a lot of different scenarios.
Yeah. The European Commission has been talking a lot about the need for better preparedness across the EU, but not everyone's happy about it. Hungary's Foreign Minister Szijjártó has been pretty vocal about his concerns.
What's he worried about?
Well, the commission recommended that people put together their own survival kits, and Szijjártó basically called them out on it. He thinks it means Brussels is getting ready for war, even though he says there's no real danger to the EU, NATO, or Russia. He's like, why would we need 72-hour emergency kits if there's no threat?
So he thinks they're overreacting. What's the Commission's reasoning for all this preparedness talk?
They put out this draft document called Strategy for Preparedness that outlines how they'd handle all kinds of crises. We're talking geopolitical tensions and conflicts, obviously, but also things like hybrid threats, cybercrime, foreign interference, climate change stuff, even natural disasters. And in that strategy, they recommend that everyone have enough essential supplies to last at least 72 hours in case any of those things happen.
So it's not just about the current conflict. It's about being ready for anything.
Yeah, it's like an all hazards approach. But this is also happening at the same time as they're talking about beefing up the EU's own defense capabilities.
So they're prepping on multiple levels.
Exactly. They're saying they need to be more self-sufficient, especially if U.S. military aid to Ukraine dries up. And they're even having internal discussions about sending in EU troops once the fighting stops.
And what does Russia think about all this talk of the EU getting more militarized?
They're not fans. They see it as going against the whole idea of a peaceful solution. They're calling Europe a party of war and saying that building up their military just makes things worse and makes it harder to negotiate.
Okay, last but not least, let's talk about peace negotiations. What's the U.S.'s take on whether peace talks are actually possible? President Trump had some thoughts on this.
He said he thinks there's been some progress in negotiations, but he also said there's still a lot of animosity between everyone involved.
He's always said he wants to help solve this, hasn't he?
Yeah, getting this conflict sorted out was a big part of his campaign. And since he's back in the game, there have been reports of direct talks between the U.S. and Russia, including at least 2 phone calls between Trump and Putin.
And then there were those talks in Riyadh that we talked about before with the U.S., Russia, and Ukraine.
Yep, those talks happened from March 23rd to 25th, and apparently they agreed on something specific about maritime security in the Black Sea. The Kremlin confirmed that there was an agreement with the U.S. on this Black Sea initiative, but they also said it won't happen unless certain sanctions are lifted, including the ones on Ras Al-Khaimah.
Sounds like the U.S. has a tough job trying to make everyone happy.
Oh, for sure. And then Secretary of State Rubio pointed out that some of what Russia wants is actually controlled by the EU, so it's not even like the U.S. can just decide to give it to them. So the U.S. is definitely thinking hard about all of this, and it sounds like Trump's going to have to make the final call.
Makes sense. There's also been talk about a ceasefire as a first step towards bigger negotiations. Any updates on that?
Ukraine apparently said they were ready for a 30-day ceasefire after talking to the U.S. on March 11th. Putin seemed okay with the idea at first, but then he brought up some concerns, like what would happen with arms shipments, troop movements, and military training during that ceasefire. But then, after talking to Trump, he said he'd go for a 30-day pause on energy infrastructure attacks, which was a U.S. proposal that Zelensky also said he was cool with.
So they agreed to stop attacking for 30 days.
That's what it sounded like, but then there were reports that attacks were still happening.
Ugh, this is so frustrating. Why?
Well, the Kremlin said it's because they don't have total control over the Ukrainian military, basically saying it's hard to make everyone stop fighting, even if the people at the COP agree to it.
Wow. So it sounds like the U.S. thinks a ceasefire has to happen before they can even start talking about real peace. But obviously, there's still a lot of things standing in the way.
Yeah, definitely. Trump said that he thinks both Russia and Kyiv actually want peace, but he also kind of hinted that Russia's not exactly rushing to make it happen.
Well, there you have it. This whole situation is messy, to say the least. We've got a potential Black Sea agreement that hinges on international sanctions. Talks about EU troops being sent in, which could change the whole military situation. Ukraine standing firm on not owing the U.S. money. The EU getting ready for all kinds of crazy scenarios. And the U.S. trying to walk this tightrope and get peace talks going.
It's like a giant web. You pull on one strand and the whole thing shakes.
Exactly. And with all these different viewpoints and so much up in the air, it's tough to say what's going to happen next. But that's why we're here, right? To try to make sense of it all.
Absolutely. It's all about figuring out how these pieces fit together. The maritime security, the potential new troops, the money, the preparations for the unexpected, and that huge hurdle of getting everyone to the table and actually wanting peace.
And who knows, maybe one of these things will end up being the key that unlocks the whole situation. Only time will tell, I guess. Anyway, we're out of time for today. But don't forget to subscribe to our podcast on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and YouTube. We are here to make things clear. New episodes every day.